I just find it fascinating all the time because my mom's family's from Italy, but from the eastern part of it. They used to belong to Austria before the First World War. So next to Slovenia, basically. But I've got other family members who are from Hungary and whatnot, and I always been fascinated since I spent a lot of time in Russia and Ukraine and whatnot. But like I've always been fascinated by the sort of relationship we have, which is like in your previous comment, sort of still lingers there, right? Because there used to be this East-West communist capitalist divide, but now we have sort of what would you say, a liberal nationalist divide, maybe, or a left-right divide, sort of inherent in that system as well, which is for me fascinating.
Yeah,
And
well, coming over here as an American, it quickly made it clear to me how little most of us Americans, even people like me who consider ourselves pretty worldly and educated, how little we know about the history of this part of the world. I tell Americans who come over here, and also Western Europeans, I say the most important political fact to know about Hungary is the Treaty of Trianon.
mm,
Their first thought is, wait, what's that? Well,
yeah,
it's the treaty that settled affairs between the victorious Allies in World War I and Hungary. What it ended up doing was shearing away about 2/3 of Hungarian territory to give to other peoples to make their own nations, like the Slovaks, got free from Hungary and now they have Slovakia. I've got friends in Slovakia, I've got friends in Romania, all that. I don't take a side on Trianon. But the Hungarians experienced Trianon as if it was a wound inflicted on them last week.
mm,
Even young Hungarians who clearly have no memory of something that happened over 100 years ago, they really feel it as a deep national trauma. And so I tell people that when you wonder where this powerful impulse in Hungary among Hungarians for sovereignty comes from, well, that's it. I mean, these are people who've had to fight for almost 1,000 years, one way or the other, to keep their nation. And I'm not saying they were always victims. You talk to Slovaks and others, and they'll tell you how oppressed they felt by the Magyars when the Magyars were in power. Nevertheless, 100 years ago, well, more than 100 years ago, you come to Budapest and you would have seen one of the richest and most dynamic rising cities in Europe. You go look at that gorgeous parliament building on the banks
yeah,
of the Danube. That was begun in the late 19th century, finished in the first decades of the 20th century, for a nation that saw a brilliant future for itself. And then came the war, and then came World War II, and then came 40 years of Soviet occupation. So they've had the shit knocked out of them, and they naturally feel like they want to fight anything that gets in the way of their sovereignty. And you don't have to agree with Hungarian policy, government policy, but you do need to understand that it comes from somewhere. It comes from specific historical experiences. Now, for Americans to hear that, we can't remember what happened 5 years ago. This is a real shock, but you won't get anywhere understanding the Hungarians if you don't put Trianon at the front of your deliberation.
and of course, like the corollary to that is Poland. They have their own version of that history in that sense of losing nationhood and being split up, and then the 20th century with all the horrors as well as the Hungarians. I mean, they have a close link in that space, but they have always had sort of and now obviously different outlooks when it comes to things like geopolitics. But when it comes to culture, it's very evident for me as a Swede that these two countries in Europe have a special place when it comes to culture and politics, and also in the imagination, I think, of political discourse in Europe. You always get them either as boogeymen, which is the standard comment from, I think, liberal commentators, that these countries are authoritarian and they're dictatorships and very close, akin to sort of Putinist Russia. But still a part of the European system. And this is always sort of told as a lament and a cautionary tale. But then you also have in these countries a very different outlook than many Western European countries have, especially with immigration, of course, but also when it comes to culture and things like that. These are countries that are, I think Orban said it. He said, well, not all Hungarians are, religious in the old-fashioned sense, going to church on Sundays, but they're religious in the cultural sense, right? And this is the topic I think I want to deep dive into with you, because I think you're one of the people. I think this is one of the things I really loved about your writing, and I think this is what makes you a beautiful guest on this podcast. Because as an American, you sort of living in Europe and writing about these issues your entire life, you're eminently placed to comment on this.
Well, what Carl is saying, Rod, is that you're already European in spirit.
Yeah.
I take that as a compliment, certainly, because, it's funny when I think about ending up here. I'm 57 years old and, well into middle age. When I was a child growing up in the rural South, I grew up in the countryside in South Louisiana near the Mississippi River. I would go as a very small boy before kindergarten. I would go through a pecan tree orchard and visit my elderly aunts, Hilda and Lois. They were born in the 1890s. And when I knew them in the early 70s, they were quite old, but they lived alone in a small cabin. And they had had such adventurous lives. They had both been Red Cross nurses in World War I, serving at the front in Dijon. And I remember Hilda would tell me, just regale me with these stories about being in France during that time. And she was on the Champs-Élysées when the armistice was announced, and a Frenchman grabbed her and kissed her. And, you can imagine being a little boy, a bookish little boy who wasn't very athletic and didn't get into the hunting, which was the common culture where I was raised, to sit there and listen to these old ladies talk about their adventures in France and in Europe. It was mesmerizing to me. And they would also introduce me to the news. I remember hearing the words Brezhnev and Kissinger in Moscow and all of that stuff, because these old ladies were very worldly. And they would sit there in that little cabin in the country and read Time magazine to me and just teach me about the world. I say all this because they seeded me with a deep curiosity about Europe and an appreciation for Europe as the motherland of us Americans. And I'm so grateful for that now. And I like to think of them as looking down on me from heaven or wherever they are, and feeling a sense of pride that because of the seeds they planted, their great nephew is now living here.
You've read about him before, but I see I think a bust of Dante.
You do. Dante and Ignatius Riley. Did you ever read the novel Confederacy of Dunces?
I've heard of it. I've never read about it.
Oh, it's the fifth gospel. It is a classic New Orleans novel. It's a comic novel of this guy, Ignatius Riley, who is a medievalist at war with the modern world. And he's a ridiculous figure, but I identify with Ignatius. So I've got Ignatius, I've got Dante, and I've got Solzhenitsyn there. Yeah. These are my boys.
That sounds like a novel pretty much written for myself as well. I have to admit. It's very interesting. I think the Louisiana connection is also interesting because as a European, it's one of the parts of the United States that's linked with the continent and not with the Anglo-Saxondom, so to speak. It's very the bayou has always fascinated me. I don't know why. Maybe it's the Cajun thing, the Creole. I've never been, but there we are.
Okay. Look. Let's just say right now that you and I are going on a road trip to New Orleans.
That's amazing.
If we go during football season, LSU football season, you're not going to believe it. The true religion of South Louisiana is Louisiana State football, college football.
Yeah, and you just lost your opening game, I think. So yeah, I just saw the Saints beat the brakes out of somebody though. So I mean,
we let them win. We won. Confidence. Anyway,
but maybe. For those who are joining, and we'll edit this, as I said, heavily, but for those who are joining, we're joined by Rod Dreher, who's American conservative, columnist, writer, a commentator on all things, living in Budapest at the moment. Rod, you've written a lot of books. The three that come to mind are your book on Dante, How Dante Can Save Your Life, I think is the title. Obviously, the book you're probably most recognized for and sort of conservative circles might be the Benedictine Option.
Benedict.
The Benedict Option, which we will, I think, come back to, and Live Not by Lies, which I think is your last book. Thank you, first of all, for coming to the program.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I really am enjoying living in Europe. I've been here 3 years now, pretty much, and it's just so much different from what even Europhiles like me back in America think it is. And I love meeting new people, especially conservatives, because we have this impression in the U.S. that Europe is full of liberals, and that's it. It ain't necessarily so. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
It's interesting because the sort of elite relationship between Europe has always been that. I mean, the sort of story has always been of American expats going to countries like Paris in the early 20th century, and it's full of arts and it's full of letters and it's full of ideas. But and I think that also sort of warps the image we sort of have of ourselves, because Europe is a deeply and very, maybe not in a political sense, but in a cultural sense, traditional place. This cannot be said, I think, in the same way about the United States. You have deeply traditional parts of the countries, but in my thinking, that's mainly sectarian in a sense, and maybe also sort of like rural-urban divide. But I think that the interesting thing with your writing, and it has this, as we've said, deeply European thread, and it's obviously not a big mystery why this is, because we're linked by this amazing culture. And I think reading your book and being aware of you thinking of the Benedict Option, sorry. And I want you to describe sort of your thesis in this book, because I think it will be a good intro to where we will begin our discussion about culture and religion.
The book, The Benedict Option, it was published in the US in 2017, and now it's in 11 languages. It is my idea or my thoughts about how to preserve traditional Christianity in a post-Christian world. I'm a convert to Christianity. I was raised in a sort of very mild, non-observant Protestant home. I lost my faith entirely as a teenager. And then in 1984, when I was 17 years old, my mother won a guided tour to Europe in a church contest. And she didn't want to go, but me at 17, I wanted to go to Paris and go to the museum, see where Hemingway was. I was totally in love with the whole lost generation idea in the 1920s. So I was the only young person on a bus full of elderly American tourists, but I didn't care. I was going to Paris. On the way to Paris, the bus stopped at an old church, maybe an hour outside the city. And I didn't even want to get off the bus and go look at this old church, but I didn't want to sit there for an hour. So off I went. This was the cathedral at Chartres. Well, there was nothing. I didn't even know what this was, but there was nothing growing up, in rural America, late 20th century, that prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in this medieval cathedral. I remember standing there in the labyrinth, looking around at the stained glass windows and the vaults. And I thought, God really does exist. And not only does he exist, he wants me. And I wasn't expecting that. I didn't leave the church a reconverted Christian, but I left it on a search that eventually, 9 years later, led me to become a Catholic. Now, we can go into that story if you want to later, but eventually, after 13 years and writing about the abuse scandal, I lost my Catholicism and became Eastern Orthodox. The point is simply this, though. I became enamored of the world that produced Dante. And this caused me to develop this deep, deep love for the church in history, and of course, for Europe. So fast forward to where we are today. And in my case, this is when the first ideas started occurring to me around 2005. It's so clear we're living through the rapid de-Christianization of Western civilization. This is not news in Europe, but for we Americans, we like to think of ourselves, at least in my generation and older, of being immune to this. Well, we're not. And I remember reading this philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. He's very old now, but MacIntyre wrote in this book, After Virtue, probably his most famous book, where he compared the situation we're living now in the West to the last years of the Roman Empire in the West. Everything is falling apart and so on and so forth. But he said in the final paragraph, MacIntyre did, that what we're waiting for now is a new and doubtless very different Saint Benedict. So who was Benedict? Benedict of Nursia was a monk, the monk who was responsible for Western monasticism. He was born 4 years after in 480, 4 years after the final Roman emperor abdicated. And he went down to Rome. His parents were Christians who lived in the mountains of Umbria. They sent him to Rome to finish his education. And he realized when he got there that if he stayed there immersed in the world, he was going to lose his faith. So he went out to the woods, lived in a cave for 3 years, as one does, and prayed and read scripture and said, what should I do? Well, he ended up coming up with what we call now the Rule of St. Benedict, which was a simple, short book about how to live together in a community. He didn't know what he was doing then. He died in, I think, 547, and when he died, he had founded like 12 or 13 monasteries, and that would have been impressive enough. But what he did, Benedict, was lay the groundwork for the rebirth, for the preservation, and then ultimately the rebirth of Western civilization. So my question with the Benedict option is, what should we Christians today do? We who live in the world, who aren't monks, are there things we can learn from what the Benedictines did that would enable us to preserve the source code, you might say, of Western civilization through this great dissolution, to the dissolving of Western civilization? And the answer I came up with and wrote about in the book is, yes, there are things we can do. The problem, though, is that, when I published the book, it became hugely controversial in the U.S. Christian circles because so many Christians, normie Christians, are desperate to believe that we haven't lost this, that now we're still relevant, that this is just a phase the West is going through. Everybody's going to come back to Christianity. I just don't see it. And I think that a lot of this negative reaction was a form of cope by conservatives and Christians who just couldn't bear the weight of a post-Christian reality.
I think for many of our European listeners who are like, I think me and Johan raised very secularly and sort of lived very secularly, and up until recently might have viewed this as a very Amerocentric and very a problem only faced by religious conservatives. But in 2024, it's interesting to see the kinds of people coming to similar, if not the same, sort of analysis of where we were at. You have people like Richard Dawkins, who, like the arch atheist of the 2000s, saying that he's not a believer, but he is a cultural Christian. Mm-hmm. And you have books like Tom Holland's Dominion, which basically goes on stating that the fruits of Western civilization is not sort of antiquity and the Enlightenment that we're taught in universities and schools, but it's the Christian tradition and the sort of fading away of that tradition, and maybe sort of I wouldn't say maybe perverting, but also the the hijacking of that tradition of a sort of woke left movement is, and the sort of results are very visible to, I think, very secular people. So this is not for me only a Christian conservative book from the US, but a very, very relevant commentary on the West itself. And as you said, the sort of end of the Roman Empire is very apt, I think, here. And maybe a touch, some people have this apocalyptic view of the end of the empire, but I think what you sort of managed to do in the book is very lay it out as it was, right? It was a transition. It wasn't an end. This guy didn't, so to speak, fall on people, and everyone wasn't out in the street screaming. It was a gradual thing that happened, and then disappearance of civilization. And I think many people are looking into the future of our culture and wondering the same thing. What's going to happen?
You know, Carl, a book that I've been recommending to people lately is called The Final Pagan Generation by an American historian named Edward Watts. And in the book, he writes about the transition in the Roman Empire in the 4th century from being pagan to being Christian. And it's a sort of thing that, you know, most people who don't know any details about that period, and that would have included me at one point, just assume that, oh, Constantine converts and everything in the early part of the 4th century, everything falls into place. But that's not how it went, of course. What he means by the final pagan generation are those born in the Roman Empire when it was still pagan, the last people to have any memory of what it meant to live in a pagan empire. What's so interesting about the book is he points out, by citing the writings of certain pagan Roman elites, they didn't realize what was happening to them. They really did believe that, well, that Rome has always been pagan and always will be. Yes, these Christians are here, but hey, the temples are still open. We still have our festivals. You know, everything's going to be fine. And when at the end of the century, the 380s and the 390s, when mob violence broke out between young pagans and young Christians, these people didn't recognize what they were seeing because their moral imagination could not cope with it. Well, I think this has obvious applications to today for Christians, and not just for Christians, but also liberals. And liberals not in the sense of the left wing, but all of us in the sense that, you know, left liberals and right liberals. We think liberalism, at least in America, it's been this way. We think of liberalism as a natural state of humanity. Mm-hmm. I remember back in when America was marching up to the disastrous Iraq War, people who would criticize this, I'm talking about people on the right, like Patrick Buchanan. I said, you can't impose liberal democracy on the Iraqis. They're not culturally ready for it. The thing that the neocons would say is, what, you think that Arabs don't deserve democracy? That wasn't the point at all. The point was that liberal democracy emerged at the end of a long, often bloody process in the West. And it's a precious gift that's not human nature. In any case, I think that what we are all going to live to see, whether we're Christian or not, is what society looks like absent Christianity. Because as Tom Holland writes about this in Dominion, but others have written about it too, the Enlightenment and the liberalism that emerged out of the Enlightenment was just a secularized form of Christianity. So the question becomes, can we keep what is so good about liberalism without what I call the source code, which is Christianity? I don't think we can. And I think we're going to see, and we're already starting to see, that absent Christianity, a vital Christianity at the center, we're going to see clashes between the Nietzschean right and the neo-Marxist left.
So I want to piggyback in here and coming back in a way to one of the comments I think Carl made or questions to you, Rod, that there's in Europe or in Hungary sort of cultural religiosity that people have a religious sense of meaning in life, place in the world. And I think if you would go out on the street in Sweden, in any city, and ask people if they're religious, you would get some kind of answer of, well, I don't believe in God, but I believe in something, and this something is some form of cultural religiosity that I think perhaps it is that Hungary and Sweden are peasant nations in this sense that you have a folklore village vibe to it, that makes the faith more animistic, but not relativistic, if that makes sense. But the question to you in this regard is if it's an apocalypse that people experienced at the fall of the Roman Empire, those people would then, they might have turned from paganism to Christianity, but in our sense, then I wonder if you could speak to the other meaning of apocalypse as a sort of revelation, that the fact that you have people like Richard Dawkins realizing that I am a cultural Christian, that the source code is there, and it's people begin, or liberals in this case, begin to view themselves more anthropologically, in the sense that it's not just about ideals anymore, but for better or worse, I am Christian. I cannot divest myself from this. When I see this being dismantled, something instinctively within me kicks back. And I don't think that we as a civilization, or culturally speaking, had that sense of acute awareness of what you cannot take away without literally cutting off pounds of flesh, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, that's really true. I mean, I'm a big fan of the novels of Michel Houellebecq, not because it's necessarily pleasant to read, but I think Houellebecq is a great diagnostician of our cultural malaise. And Houellebecq, he's not a religious man, but he has said that he is a follower of Auguste Comte, who is the founder of sociology. And Comte believed that every human civilization has to have a religion, has to have some sense of what has been called a sacred canopy that covers us, that helps us to frame our lives and give meaning to our lives. It's not a question of whether it's true or not. The question is, or the point is, that people believe it's true. It's something outside of themselves, and it helps them know what to do. Alistair McIntyre famously said that we cannot know what to do in life until we know of which story we are a part. Christianity gives you a story. The story of the Bible becomes a story of all the Christian people. Islam gives you a story. Other religions give you a story. The story that the post-Christian West has taken on is a story of individual liberation. The liberation of the will, of the desire to control your own life, pleasure, and so forth. It turns out that you can't live on that. You can't live on that beyond a few generations. And this is what Michel Houellebecq writes about. His great book, Submission, Soumission, is that the Muslims are not the villains in that book. The villains are we modern people who believe that we could build a society on individualism, on shopping, on sex, that sort of thing. And it just is not possible. You end up with a sort of spiritual desolation that is so common today, especially in Europe, but also increasingly in America. I remember a few years ago when I was in France, 2018, doing a Benedict Option book tour there. I had coffee with Alain Finkielkraut, one of the top French intellectuals, a secular Jew from the 1968 generation. And he listened to my ideas. He was very respectful. And at the end, I said, well, Professor, where do you find hope? Oh, by the way, I should say that we had been talking about Houellebecq and about how there's the desolation that's in post-Christian France. I said, where do you find hope? He said, I have no hope. And he didn't say it in a dramatic way. He just said it, sort of shrugged his shoulders and like, this is life. And I told him that I do have hope, and it comes from my Christian faith. But I told him, knowing that I'm speaking to a French atheist intellectual, I said, look, I'm not saying this to you in the TV evangelist, shallow American sense. I'm not an optimist, but there's a difference for a Christian between hope and optimism. Yeah. Optimists think the best is always going to come. But someone who is hopeful believes that even if the worst comes, there's meaning in our suffering. And Christianity explains that, or gives you a way to find meaning even in suffering and even hope for redemption. he listened to me patiently and said, well, that's good for you Americans, but here in France, we don't believe God exists. And I thought he has really cut off the path back to any sense of hope for the future by that. And I think that one of the things I did learn later, one of my later books, Live Not by Lies, which is about the lessons that Christians who stayed behind in the Soviet world and resisted communist totalitarianism, what lessons they have for us today. The main lesson I got from all of these people, whether they were in Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, Russia, is that we have to learn how to suffer well. That's it. That's the core right there. Well, I think, and maybe I'm getting a little far ahead of our discussion here, but I think the sort of totalitarianism we're living with now in the West, it's not Soviet style, but it's rather more like Brave New World. It's a totalitarianism through which people surrender their liberties for the sake of relief from their anxiety, from relief of suffering.
Can we drill into that? Sorry, Carl, to cut you off, but can we drill into that point on the totalitarianism? Because there's one thing, coming back to whether or not this is a revelatory moment for people who did not believe themselves to have faith prior to the kind of societal challenges we're seeing today. That is it that there's something about the story of Antichrist, that progressivism professes to be more Christian than Christ, to be more benevolent, more kind, caring than you can find in any phrasing of the Bible or the Gospels, including the fifth, of course. But that there's something in the behavior of these political actors. I mean, you could say that France does not have God, but France has a state, the French state, and in this sense, it's a very, very progressive idea. In Sweden, for instance, people are happy paying taxes because we pay to ourselves. You might think that's a delusion, but this is part of the metaphysics of the connection between a Sweden state, a French personal state, and I think in the US, the federal state and liberals. But it's a very much the faith of the Antichrist, if you will.
Yeah. I when I was in Hungary researching Live Not by Lies in 2019, I was on a tram going from interview to interview with my interpreter, a young Hungarian Catholic named Anna. And Anna was in her mid-30s, and she said to me, Rod, I really struggle as a Catholic, talking even to my Catholic friends. If I tell them my husband and I have been fighting a lot lately, or our little boy is keeping us up late at night, I'm exhausted all the time, they cut me off and say, oh, get a divorce, put your child in daycare, go back to the office. You have to be happy. And she said, I can't make them understand that I am happy, that I like being a wife, I like being a mom, but a happy life is not the same thing as a life without struggle. I looked at her and said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's it. Where did you get that? It's chapter 17 of Huxley's Brave New World. In that chapter, the dissident in that totalitarian society, John the Savage, is brought in to meet with the world controller for Europe, Mustafa Mond. Unlike in Orwell's 1984, where Winston Smith is tortured by O'Brien into accepting Big Brother, in Brave New World, Mustafa Mond wants to know to the dissident, why won't you be part of this society? We give you everything you want. You can have comfort all the time. We take care of you, all the sex you want, the entertainment. We give you Soma, the happy pill, etc. And Mustafa Mond calls it Christianity without tears. That's so powerful because it's a way of, it's a therapeutic pseudo-religion that cost us our humanity. Of course, John the Savage, who's not a religious man, but he's been raised only on the works of Shakespeare. And he tells Mustafa Mond that to be fully human, to experience the joys and the suffering of life, it is to suffer. It is to overcome. That's how we learn how to love and be fully human. Well, Mustafa Mond says, you can have it, And I told Anna, this is the essence of the soft totalitarianism we're living under today. People today are so terrified of suffering in any way, in their mind, in their bodies, that they will surrender their liberties and even their humanity for for the sake of avoiding it.
This seems to be more prevalent in Protestant nations in the north of Europe and in the Anglo-Saxon sphere than in other culturally Christian, maybe Catholic or Orthodox countries. I find this fascinating, and as a Swede, we always pride ourselves on being probably the most Protestant country in a cultural sense.
Well, I'm reading a book right now by famous American sociologist James Davison Hunter. He's the sociologist who in the 1990s came up with the term culture wars. And his new book is called Democracy and Solidarity. And in it, Hunter tries to talk about how we have lost in the US the underlying cultural conditions, the pre-political cultural conditions that make for a liberal democracy and solidarity. In the book, he tells me things I didn't know about my own country's history, about how the American ideal is a fusion of the Enlightenment with Calvinism. And he's a Calvinist himself, but he explains how over the course of the 19th century, this idea that we can remake humanity, we can start over again, and it comes from the Puritans, right? But it was not just the Puritans. It by the end of the 19th century, it had produced what we call progressivism. Now, that's a specific term used in American history to describe the sort of what we call the social gospel, the idea that the gospel is there for social reform. Now, that's an important part of the gospel. But what your question or your observation brings up, Carl, is how in Protestantism, as opposed to Catholicism, the whole question of suffering is pushed to the side. Not intentionally necessarily, but in Catholicism, whenever you go into a church, there is a cross at the center of things on which hangs the tortured body of the God-man. That's not what you see in Protestant churches. And it's not that they don't believe in the crucifixion and things like that, but as part of their moral imagination, that suffering, which is at the core of the Catholic understanding of the Christian story, it's just not there. And I thought about how this is one of the reasons I lost my faith as a young man. In our Methodist church, which my parents didn't go to often, but that set the tone. Church was only for psychological uplift. It's where you went to be reminded, I'm part of this community. This is what the white Southern middle class believes. You hear from your pastor an encouraging message, but it was this shallow, And when I discovered as a young adult, after going to Chartres and then deciding, what is this religion? And I started reading about Catholicism, and it struck me as so much truer to human nature and human history than the sort of self-help therapeutic gospel I got from mainstream Protestantism. Now, I should say that in the US today, something became so clear to me when I began traveling more in Europe as an adult, Catholicism has become almost thoroughly Protestantized in this particular way, where you're only going to get, in most Catholic churches, therapeutic uplift.
I think it was there was a sociologist in the beginning of the 2000s who came up with the MTD, right? The moralistic therapeutic deism. Yeah, which is basically what all mainstream churches have become. Like this, as you said, sort of puddle deep, and also, I mean, basically like airport literature, self-help, encouragement, with the face of God and the sort of the aesthetics of religion, but basically that. And it struck me. I baptized my son the other year in the Swedish church, mainly for quote unquote traditional reasons, being the fact that, well, everyone in my family has been baptized in the Swedish church. Well, besides my mom, who's a lapsed Catholic, but that was also a part of her like tradition, right? You, this is what you are, right? But like talking to the priest, she said, well, you don't have to really believe this, right? I mean, I don't really believe, in the church is sort of this oppressive structure. You don't really have to, pay attention to the sort of sacrament, or no, she didn't obviously use the word sacrament, but the ritual and the sort of overhanging structure. You should just focus on love and sort of core message of Christianity. And I thought, I've been to university, I've heard this talk before. The core message of Christianity, I would almost wanted to shout out, who are you to talk about the core message of Christianity? Like, yeah. And what are we doing here? Like,
she's credentialed, man. I mean, she has a degree. What do you want?
Yeah. So I mean, but this is, I mean, and going to, and this is sort of my own journey. Going to, for instance, Catholic service, which is in this country, is I think slightly more conservative than in many liberal parishes in the U.S. There's talk about God, about sacrament, about tradition, about gospel, about all these things that in the Swedish church, in which I'm brought up and confirmed, been going to at least Christmas and Easter services all my life. I mean, you get basically political rally stuff in the Swedish church, and this is sort of what we've come to expect about religion. And I think sort of everyone from Tom Holland, who's a British, Cambridge, sort of Oxbridge liberal, to Jordan Peterson, to like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, everyone's picking up on this, that there's something very wrong, not only in sort of university circles, or in the leftist, sort of liberal leftist discourse, but in, as you said, the fundamentals of sort of religion and how we think about these things.
Yeah, I have a new book coming out in October called Living in Wonder, and it's about the experience of awe and mystery as at the core of religious experience, and how we are not going to hold on to our faith unless we center that primal experience of awe as part of our religious experience. And one of the things that inspired this thesis in this book was that scene in Welbeck's Submission. I don't know if you've read it, but Francois, the protagonist, he's a dissolute alcoholic professor at the Sorbonne. He can see that Islam is slowly taking over France, and he can also see that French hedonism is not enough to resist it. He feels this call to go to Rocamadour, which is a medieval Catholic pilgrimage site in France. He goes there, he's in the church, and he begins to have a mystical experience. And he's just on the verge of surrendering, but then he says, "Oh no, it must have been something I ate." He leaves, goes back to Paris, and converts to Islam, not because he believes, he doesn't, but because they promise him in the new order, you can have 3 wives and an easy life. Well, what interests me is that moment of decision that Francois had. Like, there is something here, maybe, but if there is something here, it's going to require something of me that I don't necessarily want to give. In the new book, I tell a story of this American novelist named Tobias Wolff. He was a big deal in the 80s and 90s. You don't hear much from him anymore, but he related a tale from his youth when he was 27 years old. This must have been in the 70s or early 80s. He was raised Catholic, but wasn't a real believer. Yet he had enough of the sense of do-gooder in him to spend one summer at Lourdes, the site in France where they had this miracle and people go there seeking healing of their sickness. So he went to Lourdes and spent his summer volunteering to take people who were so crippled they couldn't make it into the waters themselves. He was one of those who would pick up these people, take them into the water, then accompany them back to their hotel or the airport. Well, he talked about one day he was assigned to help this Italian girl who was a quadriplegic. All of her limbs were paralyzed. She was 9 years old. He went with the group to meet the pilgrims from Italy at the airport. They had a chartered plane. He accompanied her to the grotto. He took her into the water and then went back to the airport with her. And he said that he was just overwhelmed by pity for this poor child who was suffering horribly, but suffering with great calm. And he said they were on the tarmac there. It was August. It was miserably hot. They were sweating buckets. And he was trying so hard to keep the flies off this little girl. Then he looked around and noticed that everyone else had been loaded onto the plane and the door to the plane had closed, but the little girl was still there on the tarmac. So he said he ran over to the plane and started pounding on the door, screaming, "Open up, you've forgotten her." He said he just began to sob uncontrollably at just the pity of this poor child. The door opens up, they get the girl loaded back on, and the plane goes on its way. And he takes the bus back to the dormitory at Lourdes. Well, he said on the way back, he couldn't see. He had very bad vision, but he was too vain as a young man to wear glasses. But suddenly his vision was perfect. He had been healed of his blindness. He was overwhelmed. He got to the dorm and went and found an Irish guy and said, "You're not going to believe what happened to me." He felt this need to go down to the grotto just to thank God for the miracle. But he never made it to the grotto. He started drinking beer with the Irish guy. The next morning he wakes up and his vision is back to where it always had been. Years later, reflecting on that, there's a point to this, Carl. Years later, reflecting on that story, he told his interviewer that, the truth was, I didn't want that miracle. Of course, I wanted to see again. But I knew somehow that if I accepted the miracle by thanking God, I would have to change my life in ways that I wasn't prepared to do.
Yes.
And so the miracle was taken from me. There is such a powerful story in that for all of us. There's so many people who would like the comforts of Christianity, the metaphysical assurance, the sense of awe, and all the good things, but they don't want to sacrifice. You can't have it both ways. Everybody wants to get to heaven, but nobody wants to die.
And I feel that myself every day, I think, I mean, this is sort of the post-Christian, but also the quintessential Christian experience, right? Mm-hmm. Always being on the verge of something, and this yearning to live in a sort of way and connecting. But this is also where the sort of modern world sort of kicks you in the ass and says, well, this is rubbish. You have to do laundry on Sunday, blah, blah, blah. And this sort of efficiency of modern life comes up against revelation and spiritual needs. And I see, I mean, even people like, it's interesting watching people like Jordan Peterson, for instance, who, I mean, his wife is a Catholic, I know, converted, and a lot of people in that sphere seem to be on the verge of committing to sort of, they say, well, it's psychologically true, it's philosophically true, and that means basically that for all intents and purposes, it's what we mean with true, that criteria.
Well, it's modern parlance for God. It's like living as if God existed, but it's still within the modern time.
Yeah. But that's the problem, right? Because the modern world, and I think this is the interesting thing with Hollenbeck, and I think, and maybe the difference between Europe and the US, because with the sort of immigration and with our sort of meeting up with Islam and this continent sort of having to face the very, very real consequences of Islam, which is basically that apostasy is a real thing. Sacrilege is a real thing. And even if you do not believe that those concepts are true, there are people who act as if they are true, hence they are true, right?
Yeah.
So, and as Hollebeck says, and as you said, I mean, when the secular sort of post-Christian mind comes up against that, something happens. And for me, I think this is what sort of triggered Dawkins's, culture of Christianity, in that sense of, well, if something can overtake this, if all the things that I sort of grew up with, knowing or thinking always would exist, can sort of disappear, and if apostasy can become a crime again, maybe not in law, but in de facto, right?
Yeah.
Other things can happen.
The final secular liberal generation, Dawkins, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I write in the Living in Wonder, the new book, about re-enchantment. I mean, in the Max Weber sense, that we live in a disenchanted world post-Enlightenment. The fact is, we are all re-enchanting very quickly, but where we're not necessarily going back to Christianity. I remember, and I tell this story in the book. A couple of years ago, I was at a small conference at Oxford, and during a break, a young man came up to me, a guy named Daniel Kim. Korean, British, raised in London. He was in seminary at Oxford, 27. And he said, listen, I have something I have to tell you because I know you're working on this re-enchantment book. The new atheism is something for your generation, me, Gen X, in my 50s. He said, my generation has no interest in it at all. It's dead. But they're not going back to Christianity. I said, so what's happening? He said, they're going to some form of the occult. Like, wait, are you serious? He goes, oh, yeah. Before he went to seminary, he worked in advertising in London at a very high level. He was a very gifted videographer. He told me that in his office in the firm in London, he was the only Christian, which is no surprise, but there were no atheists either. I said, what were people? He said, everyone was involved with the occult to one degree or the other. And two of them are even open Satanist, and they describe Satanism as learning how to live up to your fullest human potential. And he went on to tell me that, he said, I know I'm going to be dealing with this kind of thing for the entirety of my life as a priest. And it's something that your generation, he said to me, really has to contend with, because people are desperate now, young people, for re-enchantment. But they don't see it in the church. They don't even think to look to the church. The church to them looks just like moralism or politics. So they're going where they think they can get it, which is to some form of paganism.
So maybe, sorry, Carl, do you want to interject here? Because I feel like my head is bursting at this point.
Yeah, no, I think I'm going somewhere you want to go as well, Johan. So I don't know. Did you see the Robert Eggers film, The Northman, by any chance, Rod?
No, I didn't.
Sorry, Rod. So you have to see this movie.
So I think this is a sort of watershed moment in me and Johan's discourse on religion, because what Eggers does in this movie is he basically tells the real story of the proto story, I guess, Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is a Norse story. But he tells it with the characters fully believing, and the movie fully believing in the sort of metaphysics of the Norse world.
Mm-hmm.
And hence people do not, as people do, believe. I mean, you if you watch a historical movie about any age nowadays, people are basically 20th century people or 21st century people. I mean, and it's not even in the most extreme, the new Lord of the Rings or Tolkien adaptations where you have this sort of, vulgar version of this. But even in all movies, if there's a medieval movie, people are, medieval costumes, but they talk and they walk and they most especially think and they believe as if they were sort of 20th century actors living in Rome. But what Eggers does is he fully commits the movie and his vision to a sort of bloody Norse metaphysics of death and revenge, and a movie that is unapologetically pagan. And I remember watching that movie, and I told myself, So this is sort of what, when Tom Holland writes about, well, world before Christianity was not this, Rome and Greece, and everything was white marble, and there were enlightened discourses and orgies and free love and sort of the Woodstock meets the Enlightenment. But it was bloody, it was vengeful, and it was tyrannical. And this is a thing that we do not meet in culture all too often. A storytelling that sort of takes itself seriously and challenges your sort of moral propositions. And I went to you and I said, you have to watch this, because this is what the world with Christianity looked like.
But I think this was interesting, Carl, that it, for you, it really struck the chord in yourself of how, I remember you saying, wow, I really am Christian. Like, it occurred to you how Christian you were. Whereas for me, that wasn't the case. I was like, oh, the world of the Northman makes more sense to me. But it was very interesting to see this kind of like, it very much is the software or the source code, as you described it, Rod, that of the different faiths. And it's not, I mean, obviously it would be preposterous to say that 500 years of state revolution in the form of Protestantism in Sweden would not leave some kind of trace in the general populace. Of course, I have Christian source code and software, but it struck a chord with regards to the young student who went to seminar that you met in Oxford, that this is reenchantment for my generation. This is what seems vital, what it seems real, that is not moralistic. You follow our trail of thought here?
I do follow. And look, I mean, one of the things that brought me to Christianity as part of my path back to Christianity was reading Kierkegaard. We
cannot endorse this. It's a Dane. We have to. Worse than any Muslim you can bring up.
Well, I saw he has this idea of stages on life's way. You start out in the aesthetic sphere, then you move to the ethical sphere, and then finally the religious sphere, which both encompasses and transcends them both. I don't want to get into all this closely, but I saw myself in the aesthetic sphere, someone for whom pleasure and staying entertained was the highest goal. Boredom was a root of all evil. Yeah. But I also could look at the ethical sphere, those who lived by a certain ethical code, even a Christian code, as being the sort of people I grew up around, people who didn't necessarily go to church, but they had a very strong code. But what was the point? Just following the rules for the sake of following the rules. And mind you, that's an immature way of seeing it. But this was also Kierkegaard's point, too, that maybe it's a higher mode of existence to live by an ethical code. But in the end, is that all there is? And then, of course, there's a religious sphere. And Kierkegaard helped open up the idea of religion for me, because I just never thought of it that way. I thought that what religion meant was either being that proper middle class ethical person, as I was raised, or being one of these televangelists that we saw on TV in the 1980s, because they were the only ones who seemed to have any passion about this. But then the whole world of Catholicism and historical Catholicism opened up to me, and now Orthodoxy. Again, you can find so many of these ethicists or aesthetic people within the churches now, no doubt about it. But the religious mode I found a way through it to re-enchant the world. And by re-enchant, I don't mean like sprinkling fairy dust all over the world and suddenly you're living in Disney paradise. I mean, the idea, a re-enchanted world is an idea, or is a world that is pregnant with meaning, transcendent meaning that we can access in some way. And that's what I write about in the book. But I really do believe, Johan, to go back to your earlier point, that if Christianity is going to survive in this century in the West, it's going to have to lean heavily on its mystical core. The famous Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner said in the 20th century that the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or he won't be anything at all. I think that's really true, because when you find yourself really suffering, like these people I talked to for the Live Not by Lies book who are in communist prisons, tortured for their faith, you're not going to be able to withstand that if all you have to hang on is Christianity as a nice do-good philosophy of social justice and blah, blah, blah. You need to believe that this is something transcendently real, and that you might even be called to give your life for that truth. I mean, Kierkegaard, your favorite Dane, himself said that truth is subjectivity, by which he meant not that, all truth is subjective. There's no such thing as truth. Rather, he meant that there are some truths, like the existence of God, for example, that can only be known subjectively by inwardly appropriating them with passion. That's kind of a hard thought to wrap your mind around as a college student, but over the course of my life, I have come to see that that is really, really the case. And people who tell themselves, as I did as a young man, well, I'll believe in Christianity when you can prove to me that this is true. You're totally missing it. I mean, if you could prove it was true, like a mathematical formula, there's still the matter of the will. You don't have to accept it. You can live in a lie if you want, if it makes it easier for you. In my own case, the thing I realized that what I thought was an intellectual struggle with Christianity on my way to conversion was in fact just me, like Francois, in submission. I just didn't want to submit. I didn't want to lose my agency. And if I'm honest, I didn't want to lose my freedom as a red-blooded American man to have sex whenever I wanted to. It was just that tawdry, but I dressed it all up in intellectual discernment. Well, I don't know that I can really. No, it was like the guy, Tobias Wolff at Lourdes. He didn't want to give up being his right, so to speak, to be a virile young American tomcat, a playboy. And that's what when I came to understand that about myself, I began to see it among a lot of people I knew who hated Christianity or who wanted to be Christian but wouldn't submit. It was all about submission, 100% about submission. Yeah, there were some who I have serious intellectual problems with it. I respect that. But we have to be honest with ourselves about what our real motivations are.
So
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Just a thought. This is sort of what the sticking point, but it's also what brings me hope in this sense. That I think, I think the sort of intellectual barrier that used to exist towards Christianity, and for everybody sort of in our generation as well, you who sort of went to university and came out the other way and sort of finds themselves in sort of the wasteland of modernity, if you will. The ironic fact is that the sort of post-modernity or just postmodern critique of the Western world and the Western way of doing philosophy and doing science and whatnot sort of has broken down the arguments for the totally rationalist approach to the world. Subjectivity used to be a thing that was looked down upon. But if you look at the universities now, all there is subjectivity.
Right.
And for all they're sort of talking about that there should be no grand narratives or no grand stories or nothing. I mean, this is what we're left with. And I think this is also a thing that leads people like myself towards faith and towards Christianity. Well, I think the critiques of the Enlightenment for being way too rationalistic, and that we can see the sort of fruits of that rationalism, and the sort of, the seed of that fruit coming to fruition now, sort of has undermined the whole project in itself. And what we're left with, in my view, is a tradition. And when you sort of peel all this away, what I see is, well, you have a culture, and what is this culture built on? It's Christianity. And if you're going to tell a story, it's going to be, I mean, undoubtedly in a way Christian. It can't not be. So this is what gives me hope. I think, you know, I tell the story a lot, but like with the Me Too movement, like I remember being radicalized, reading an interview in a Swedish magazine between, like, it was an interview between a veteran of the feminist movement, feels 1968 sort of suffragette type female, and a young early 20s girl. And they were both from Stockholm, both from sort of upper middle class milieu. And they were talking about Me Too. And the old, like, veteran lady, she was like, yeah, of course, this is what we've been talking about all this time. It's about liberation, it's about freedom. But what can be done? Like, we have to hold these men accountable. And this girl is just like, yeah, she's quite cynical, and she's like, yeah, okay, hold them accountable, but we need to do something more radical. And her thesis was, well, this having sex, free sex, and the sexual revolution obviously has left the males as the victors and females as the defeated in this sort of calculation of power. And this like 60-year-old lady was just like, okay, yeah, that might be true, but what do you want to do? No sex before marriage? And this 22-year-old girl is like, yeah, maybe.
Wow.
And this sort of radicalized my thinking about what Me Too and what the culture really is, and sort of reframed this for me. People are talking about the sort of re-enchantment of sex. You have people like Mary Harrington in the UK, and a lot of sort of traditionalist or anti-feminist, traditional feminists making this point all the time, that, you know, what we're left with is sort of where we started off. Their discussion they're having is basically, you know, Paul's letter to the Galatians or Paul's letter to the Romans. How should we live? What are we doing? Like, this female-male relationship, how should they be managed? We're back again to the sort of starting point, in my view.
You know, one of the things that I talk about in the new book that gives me hope is coming to realize that what we in the West have been given to think is just things that are obviously true are actually just one take on reality. And what I mean is this. Have you guys heard of the whole weird hypothesis, capital WEIRD?
Yeah, but you can spell it out, please.
Yeah, I'll be brief. About 25 years ago, some psychologists and sociologists in the US started to realize that all the psychological research that had been done in the field had been done actually on Westerners, and mostly college students for that matter. So what they thought was universal about human nature and human psychology was in fact very particular to the West. Making it even worse is Westerners are far, far outliers on human experience. So they came up with the idea that we in the West are weird, which is to say Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This way of seeing the world is something that developed exclusively in the West from Western experience. And we see the world, just being a human being in the West, whether you're religious or not, means you see the world radically different from almost everybody else on the planet. The lead author of this is a man named Joseph Henrich. He's at Harvard now. He came up and wrote a book about it a few years ago. Well, why is this good news? This is good news because if you come to realize that the sort of things that you take as granted, as just this is what reality is, it's actually a very narrow narrative that has been handed down to us within this culture. And in fact, if you look out around the world, people see reality rather differently in other cultures. It's not to say that we don't see reality, with some clarity that evades people in other cultures, but it is to make us question it should make us question at a deep level what we've been handed as secular liberals or as people who were raised in a more or less secular, liberal, post-Christian society. And once you start to question that, then it opens a door to many more questions, which I think can lead someone back to faith. Earlier this year, a really fascinating and I think landmark book came out in the US by a well-regarded historian named Carlos Eire, E-I-R-E. And the name of the book is They Flew. And it's about saints, historical recordings of saints in the 16th and 17th century who were observed levitating. And this was really shocking to me. Eire is a Catholic himself, but he's an academic historian. He's at the end of his career, and he apparently doesn't care what people think. but he went back into the written archives in Spain and elsewhere and found there are lots of signed testimonies signed in some cases by hundreds of people who observed these bizarre experiences in the Counter-Reformation of people levitating. What Eire goes on to say is that this doesn't prove that it really happened, but he said, with the exception of religion, there is no other area of human endeavor and experience that historians would completely disregard all this written evidence for other than religion. Now, what's fascinating about it, and some of the commentary that came out about this book said, wow, if a historian of this man's stature is willing to say that the secular materialist explanation for the world is not necessarily correct, then we're going to have a different conversation. I think that's marvelous, because I myself never seen anybody levitate, but I've had some mystical experiences myself and have talked to people, especially exorcists, who have seen and dealt with things that absolutely defy any explanation, materialist explanation. Now, the argument that the account that these people have, or that I have for what was happening there may not be correct, but it is certainly true that materialism can't explain it either.
Basically, when you start discussing Kierkegaard and his emphasis on ethics, but also on aesthetics, I'm thinking if this is also, they're not exactly corresponding in time, but there is something in his philosophy that links to Nietzschean philosophy, in the sense that there's an evaluation of the aesthetics as linked to ethics, whether or not you take the former or the latter. But I think this is something that actually gets to people's religiosity in the Nordic countries, that the kind of confusion that me and Carl are describing over this, whether or not you want to have a new Christianity or lean into something that is more pagan, is also symptomatic for not just people who are in intelligentsia or aspiring to be in our countries, but also of the general sense of being at a loss with existential questions, or the more the material that you just described with regards to the exorcism. And Carl described his struggling with or wrestling with God. So maybe you're not actually a closeted Catholic, I realize, Carl, but more maybe perhaps a Nordic Jew. But I think mine has been my struggling with faith, and I bring this up hopefully not in self-indulgence, but because it actually pertains to the question fabric of the people in progressive societies in particular that we have to deal with. In that I both as a teenager joined the left-wing movement, the revolutionary left-wing movement, and the non-conformist Christian movement in Sweden, that is like Salvation Army. That is important, I think, because you have a state church that's Lutheran and quite void of any kind of grit or dirt or even enthusiasm. That if you join something conformist, you do it because you're an outcast, or you definitely want something other than power. And it's only when, with regards to a geopolitical issue, when these kind of movements, that is the revolutionary left in Sweden, which is pro-Palestine, and the non-conformist Christians who are pro-Israel, the incongruities come to the fore. But I think they have more in common in the sense that they take existential questions seriously. Obviously, one is more resent-driven than the other, but they get at the same kind of existential vacuum left open by state worship, similar as in France that you mentioned with the intellectual you spoke with, and in Sweden. I come to think of the Nietzsche quote that man would rather wish nothingness than nothing at all. When you spoke of this church, your feeling that you walked into this European cathedral and you saw God almost in the architecture. I had similar such experiences as a teenager coming to faith, but there was one incident in 2013 that sort of shook my approach, and I should say at this point I'm probably in metaphysical sense agnostic, but there was something about these old cathedrals and the worship of them not being sufficient for what needs to come next. In 2013, when the French historian Dominique Venner walked up to the altar and shot himself in the head. And I think it's that kind of nothingness, even though he might have seen it as some kind of, I don't know, Mishima-inspired action to a call to vitality. But the fact that you sacrifice your life in the old cathedral rather than envisaging how you build a new one, that it might be the only recourse for a man of that generation. But when I look at this, my question is more of how do you build, if not the cathedrals, then the mindset to build those cathedrals? And again, I apologize for these questions being jumbled all over the place, but there's something about the conflict you stressed in the beginning of our conversation between some sort of new pagan vitality worship and the re-enchantment on the Christian side. So like the Kierkegaard emphasis rather on nice Nietzscheanism rather than just hardcore Nietzscheanism, that I think gets to this, that if we cannot envisage what the new cathedrals would be like, then we just end up going to the altars and shooting ourselves in the head.
Well, it depressed me, Johan. No, seriously, this is very important. You know, we're seeing in the U.S. right now in the Eastern Orthodox churches. Orthodoxy is very small in America, but we're seeing this influx of young men. And what are they coming for? Well, they're coming. Many of them are coming out of nothingness, or they're coming out of middle-class Protestantism or Catholicism, desperately searching for the transcendent. And leaving aside theological questions, certainly within Orthodoxy itself, within Orthodox worship and the Orthodox spiritual ethos, you have much more mysticism, much more of a sense of transcendence, accessible through beauty, through the icons, through the worship, through the smells and bells, as we say. But what's interesting about it, you can find that sort of thing, the aesthetics in, say, the high Anglican churches, but it doesn't attract men. In Orthodoxy, you get the sort of traditional Christian morality, yes, but there's something about it that speaks to the masculine soul today. I felt it myself, you know, that when you go into an Orthodox church, you don't feel that they're talking down to you to give you a happy, clappy sermon about feeling good and being nice and God loves you and all that. Of course, they talk about God loves you, but that love requires sacrifice. It requires you sacrificing your own will, your own desires for something higher, for something constructive, yes, but men want to sacrifice. It's who we are. And if you go to so many American services, Catholic or Protestant, you get none of that. You get nothing but this sort of feminized comfort. Orthodoxy is different. It's masculine, but not macho, if you appreciate the difference. Yeah. You know, you're bold, like Douglas Wilson, this Calvinist guy who's very hyper masculine, giga Chad Christianity. It's not that. There's something really serious and masculine going on in Orthodoxy, but it's also transcendent. And And of course, as I mentioned, I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I had been a Catholic, a very convinced Catholic, but I was a very intellectual Catholic. And I didn't appreciate until it was too late that a Christianity that is primarily intellectual, is not going to withstand the kind of suffering that I had to go through, and many American Catholics did once we learned the truth about the abuse scandal. And so when I became Orthodox, I knew I had to become a very different kind of a Christian. I couldn't be the guy who thought that he was deepening his faith when he was just reading more theology books and mastering the arguments. It required me to get out of myself and to make the commitment, going to church every Sunday, going to fast. Orthodox Christians fast. That's something that is completely forgotten in American Christianity. But we do without meat and dairy, for example, during Lent. It may seem like a small thing, but once you come to understand that worship involves and becoming formed as a fully Christian man requires using your body, boy, that really changes things. And it changes things in ways that are hard to articulate from the outside. I tell people that learning to be Orthodox is not so much like reading a book to master all the propositions, that doctrinal propositions. It's more like learning how to play a violin. And I really do believe that if Christianity is going to survive in the West in the long term, it's going to have to become more orthodox in the sense that I mean. It's got to be more mystical. It's got to be more involving the body and worship. And it's got to involve a serious notion of self-sacrifice, as opposed to, as Carl brought up earlier, moralistic therapeutic deism. Your listeners may or may not be familiar with that term, but the sociologist of religion, Christian Smith, invented it in 2005 to say that this is the actual existing belief of American Christians of any church. It's a pseudo-Christianity. It tells you like 4 or 5 basic propositions. God exists. He wants us to be nice and happy. You don't have to call on him unless you need something. And everybody goes to heaven except really bad people like Hitler. That's it. I was raised in a right-wing version of that as a kid, and I rightly rejected it. But that's what Christianity is like for so many people today. And it's fake. It really is fake. Of course, God loves us. Of course, God wants us to be good and to be kind to others. But there's also an intense and deep element of living sacrificially within traditional small o Orthodox Christianity. And that's the only sort of thing that's going to draw men today. Otherwise, I can see why young men reject this sort of moralistic, therapeutic, feminized form of Christianity in favor of some sort of neo-paganism, whether it's actual, like going out to the woods and pretending to be Nordics, or whether it's the more vulgar paganism of an Andrew Tate, for example.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I feel also like it's so interesting because these trends are already in sort of highbrow society. I mean, fasting is very fashionable in urban elite circles, like but it's fasting in a sort of me-centric, health-centric, a dietary sort of way. It's not in a religious way. And I think we have all these sort of pieces of the puzzle always sort of interjecting themselves in sort of modern culture. And people sort of react and they say, this new fantastic thing we found out. Who knew that you could fast? And you go, well, I mean, it is there in tradition. And it's there just, somebody just needs to tell you how to use all these tools. I feel dirty using the word tools, but I mean, this is where we will end up. Either it's that or some sort of, Gaia death cult with Greta at its head.
Yeah, there can't be a vacuum. This is what Welbeck sees, that there's no such thing as a vacuum. People have to worship something, whether it's a false religion or a politics or worshiping the self as we live now. They have to worship something. The question is only what will you worship? And, I hasten to say that people can't make themselves believe in a religion and Christianity or whatever because it's good for them, though it might be. You have to have some sort of experience of awe, of wonder, of resonance with something outside yourself. There's a great quote by a Harvard professor named Elaine Scarry. She's talking about education. And she says, real education is not imparting information from the teacher to the student. Real education is the teacher training the student to be staring at the correct corner of the sky when a comet blazes past. Well, that's really true about religion too. You can read all the doctrine and the ethics and theology you want, but what you really need to do is to train yourself through prayer, fasting, and things like that, to be staring at the right corner of the sky when God manifests himself. And I write about this in the book, I had gotten into a really depressed state around 2018. My marriage had been breaking down for 6 years, and I was nothing worked. I was so depressed by it. And I was in Italy for the Benedict Option book tour in Italy. On the last night of my speech, my tour there, I gave a talk in a church in Genoa. I had about 1,000 people there, the biggest audience I've ever had anywhere. At the end of the talk, a man comes up to me, a man about my age, and he says he speaks very bad English, but he made me understand that he's an artist and a Catholic. He said, I was praying in my studio this afternoon, and the Holy Spirit told me to come here tonight to hear the American and to give you this drawing that I made. And he gave me this gorgeous engraving of of a medieval saint, it looked like, wearing medieval clothes, kneeling on a rock in front of a sword that was down in a stone. And the saint was staring up at the sky at the sun that had a cross on it, symbolizing God. But out of the saint's ear came a serpent that was swirling down to the ground. And on the ground, the serpent had a human face. He was trying to distract the saint. The title of this work was called The Temptation of Saint Galgano. Galgano, who is that? Well, the artist couldn't explain it because his English was poor, but I thanked him for it. Got back to my hotel room that night. I Googled Galgano. Turns out Galgano Guidotti was a 12th century Tuscan nobleman who was a very violent man, but his mother had prayed for him to come back to the faith. He ended up having a vision of St. Michael calling him back, the archangel calling him to the faith. He ignored it. Then one day his horse took him to the top of a bare hill out in the countryside against Galgano's will. He had a vision of Jesus Christ and the apostles, and an angel told him, put your sword down and serve God. And Galgano said, if I could, it would be easier for me to put this sword on a stone than to do as you say. He brought the sword down on the stone, and it went into the stone almost up to the hilt. He instantly fell off his horse, converted, and lived the rest of his short life there. Now, we know about this because the sword is still in the stone. And at the time, right after he died, he was so famous in Italy that the Rome sent a cardinal there to investigate. They still have the notes in the Vatican Library of the bishop and the Galgano's mother and all the people who had been healed by him. Well, I'm sitting there in a hotel room in the Milan airport reading that, thinking, this is crazy. I didn't know, never heard of this guy. And you can go see the sword in the stone. I read a story in The Guardian from the year 2000 about how Italian scientists had gone there to investigate it. They did x-rays of the stone. The blade is down in there. They tested the metal. It's from the 12th century. Oh, that's really fascinating, but what does that have to do with me? Fast forward 2 years later, I am beyond depressed over my marriage, and COVID has come along. One night, I finally forced myself to get off my couch and go to confession to relieve this spiritual burden. I felt so great when I came back. I said, I got to watch a movie. It was late at night. Everyone was asleep in my house. Well, I was watching the movies of Andrei Tarkovsky a lot in those days, the Russian director, Soviet director. I watched a film of his that night called Nostalgia. He had made in 1983, right after he left the Soviet Union. The movie is about this guy, Gorchakov. He's a Russian writer who is in Italy working on a book, but he can't even focus on his work because he's so preoccupied with missing Russia and his family back home. And I was watching that, and his depression seemed so much like my own depression. I'm like, I know what that guy's like. But I'm nostalgic for my happy marriage, the days when my marriage was happy. Toward the end of the movie, he has a dream. And in the dream, he's walking through a ruined church. And you hear the voice of St. Catherine of Siena saying to God, please speak to him. He's so depressed. He needs to hear from you. And God says, if I spoke to him, would he even be able to hear me? She said, well, show yourself to him. He needs to see you. God says, I show myself to him every day, but he can't see me. I said, yep, that is me. I'm so lost in my own head in this depression, I can't even see God around me. When the movie was over, I said, where is that beautiful church in the dream? I Googled. It's the Abbey of St. Galgano in Tuscany. That saint, that obscure saint. I said, this cannot be a coincidence. So that is, I tell that story in Living in Wonder because it is a small example of how I believe God has spoken to me through synchronicities, through things that can't be coincidences. And what I eventually learned from this is that, I wrote this book on reenchantment. By the time I got to the end of it, I realized that the entire core message of the book is embedded in that drawing that artist gave me that night at the altar in Genoa. Now, I think that's a cool story. I love stories like that, but one could easily do like Francois in Welbeck's Submission and say, that's a nice coincidence, but really, can we really say there's meaning and move on with one's life? I believe there was meaning there, and I took it into my heart and changed the way I lived because of that. And that's one of the things I hope that people will do who read this book, to realize that, look, God is speaking to you all the time, but you've got to cultivate your own hearing, so to speak, and your own eyesight, so speaking symbolically, so you can perceive him. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
Best TED Talk I've ever heard.
A technical point. How much time do you have left?
I could go another 10 minutes, can we?
Carl, I have a specific section I want to get into.
Shoot.
Okay, so I was thinking with regards to one thing you mentioned in Live Not by Lies, where you had these, is it in Slovakia or in Poland, where it's a priest who tries to build a community or alliance between different groups. Some are Christian, some are not Christian, but the overall collaboration format is to somehow address or survive communism or this kind of totalitarian nothingness.
Yeah. I think there are two stories you might be conflating. I dedicated the book to this priest, Tomislav Kolakovic, who escaped the Nazis in his native Zagreb, went to Slovakia, and began to prepare the Catholic community there for what he knew was going to be a Soviet takeover and persecution of the church. Some of the bishops were like, oh, come on, don't scare people. It will never happen here. But thank God he did that. But there's another story too, not a priest, but involves Kamila Bendova in Prague. She and her late husband, Václav Benda, they were the only Christians that were part of Václav Havel's inner circle of dissidents. Yeah, and she told me that, I asked her, I said, look, you and your husband were very strict Catholics, but Havel and the others, they were all hippies. They didn't share your faith. Was that difficult for you? She said, no, not at all. Because when you are facing down something like totalitarianism, the most important thing you have to look for in allies is courage. You mustn't imagine that the other Catholics here in Prague were brave. They weren't. They kept their heads down. They conformed to avoid trouble. My husband and I knew that we couldn't do that. We could not be faithful Catholics if we just did that. But we also knew that we had to have friends and allies. And we found them in these secular people around Havel. And these secular people knew that my husband and I would be their allies too. It was important because not only for moral support, but if some of them got sent to prison, they needed to be able to trust people who would take care of their kids. Mm-hmm. And she told me, Camilla did, and I wrote, as you know, I wrote about this in the book, that's what Christians should look for today. And not only Christians, but everybody. Look for allies who may not share your politics and may not share your faith, but who share your courage and who will be willing to suffer, even suffer in a serious way for the sake of your shared ideals.
The question is essentially, how broad do you see this alliance of the the brave or the alliance of the courageous. How big can this tent be? If we come back to the paganist or neo-pagan or vitalist or the kind of Nietzschean strength worshipping crowd vis-a-vis something that is more attuned to the many meanings of the word meek in Christianity, that is like strong but withheld strength.
Yeah, there have to be boundaries. I am not going, for example, I'm not going to ally myself to some anti-Semite, for example, or racist, just because he shares my contempt for, the therapeutic totalitarian state. I just, that's a line I can't cross. However, we think back to the Second World War in France, and Nazi-occupied France. The communists and the royalists and the Christians all had to work together to kick the Germans out. So, I realize that the day is going to come when there is some real decisions will have to be made. I wrote the Live Not by Lies as a Christian for Christians, but it was picked up by a lot of people who aren't Christians, who are in the anti-woke crowd. For example, Heather Heying and her husband, Brett Weinstein, were atheists and leftists, but they're strongly anti-woke. They loved the book and read about it on their podcast. Barry Weiss, center-left lesbian, secular Jewish lesbian, she loved the book too, because she found enough in there to where she said that Rod and I aren't going to agree on politics necessarily. We're certainly not going to agree on homosexuality, but he's a good guy. And I would say the same about Barry, because she has actually sacrificed in a big way for principle when she quit the New York Times, not knowing what she was going to do. That's the pinnacle of American journalism, to work for the Times. And she quit doing it because she knew she couldn't tell the truth there in that woke newsroom. Barry Weiss is somebody I can ally with in good faith, and she can ally with me. But there's a difference between center-left, secular Jewish lesbian and racist Nietzschean, And I've never had to make that decision in a hard way, but I can foresee it coming. I mean, what do you think, Johan? Where do you draw the line?
I began thinking of this when I saw this, the Chariots of Fire, where they run across this Scottish sand dune outside of Edinburgh.
With the Vangelis team.
Yes, Vangelis. And there's this friendship between, in the beginning at least, a quite percent-driven Jewish middle upper class runner, who I think is more of a sprinter. And this Scottish, I think, is he Episcopalian or is he?
He'd be Church of Scotland or Calvinist or Presbyterian.
Yes,
maybe.
Very strong faith, and they developed this friendship together. And his father says something that's stuck with me, that you symbolize Christian muscularity, and I never come across this term before. The closest, of course, is the late 1800s muscular Judaism movement that predated or corresponded with Zionism. That the idea among the muscular Judaists is that you need to, as you described it with regards to the turn to orthodoxy, that God is not a relationship in the mind. It's you move God down. Is the God of the belly, where you fast and you change your metabolism and it changes you in your body entire. And if you want to build then, as the Zionists did, a state, then you need to change what is the human capital in a way of the people in that state. So, hence muscular Judaism, which would be very different from being adapted as a middleman minority within European countries, because it's dangerous to have a muscular Judaist ideology, because then you become recognized as a settler culture, essentially. This is the closest to a synthesis that I've seen between the vitalist notion and the Christian one, that there needs to be something muscular about this faith.
Sure. I was in Russia in 2019 doing reporting for Live Not by Lies, and I went one Sunday to a parish in suburban Moscow, an Orthodox parish. The priest there was a big guy, a big hairy guy, very masculine, but again, masculine, not macho. And he was young, and he saw as part of his leadership of the parish to help the men develop their masculine instincts and channel them into something good. So he had behind the parish a woodworking shop where he would teach the men of the parish, old men, young men, middle-aged men, how to chop down trees, prepare boards to make furniture and things like that. And this was something they were doing to engage their bodies, engage their hands in the creation of things, of taking raw material and making something useful for people. And for him, I mean, it wasn't about producing furniture. It was about producing a refined masculine character within orthodoxy. And I found this to be really genius because, look, I'm a soft guy. I grew up in the country with a dad who was a hunter, a man of the countryside, but I had my head in a book all the time. And I can see now that I've, reached middle age that I need to change. I need to get out of my head and get more involved in the body. You don't normally find woodworking in churches, but maybe we should. I think what this guy did was really, this priest did was really innovative. And it turns out that he also would lead in the summer for about 6 weeks, groups of young people, men and women, to the far north, to Karelia region of Russia, and to rebuild old wooden Orthodox churches that were falling apart. This was their way of channeling their passion, not only their religious passion for preserving the past and making the past live again, but using their hands in a constructive way. That kind of, you may call that muscular Christianity, I would, because again, it's not about sitting there in a lecture hall learning how to love yourself more. It's about doing things to draw you out of yourself and give greater glory to God and to serve your neighbor.
This might be a banal point, but I don't think it is. But Christ was a carpenter himself, wasn't he? So
there you go. There you go. There's a guy, Matthew Crawford. You might have heard of him before, American philosopher who wrote a book called Shop Class as Soulcraft. And in it, he talks about how what you can learn in shop class, which is the term we use in American, to describe learning how to build things in school. Mm. And he talked about it as not a Christian at the time, but, as forming our soul and how our souls are deformed if we lose the ability and the desire to work with our hands. I met Matthew Crawford finally this past summer. He and his new wife came through Budapest. And he's become a Christian. And I draw on his work in the new book, Living in Wonder. And I really look forward to seeing what's going to happen now that he applies his insights about the body and about focusing attention as the source for finding meaning and being able to push out all these extraneous thoughts that shatter our attention. I look forward to seeing what he's going to say about how that works with Christianity. Because in the book, one of the things I discovered is that is a key to re-enchantment, is learning how to control your attention. I learned in this research that the internet is perhaps the greatest disenchantment machine ever invented because it fragments our attention so much. And I'm as guilty as anybody else. I'm the guy who lies in bed at night. I'll check my email before I go to sleep. 2 hours later, I've gone down so many YouTube rabbit holes. That has spiritual effects too. It's not just wasting time, but it is fragmenting our attention and making it hard to do the kind of focus that we need to do on spiritual things and on serious things in order to live it in an enchanted way.
And it also comes full circle to the monasteries. I mean, this is what sort of made the monasteries as well. I mean, yes, intellectual pursuits, but the working part of it and the communal part of them is for civilizational purposes, maybe more.
Yeah, Carl, you're exactly right. I mean, the monks are well known for their prayers and chants, of course, but it's also important within the monastic life to work with your hands, to serve the community. And by doing that, they consider everything to be like a prayer. Sometimes you pray with your mind, sometimes you pray with your mouth, and sometimes you pray with the hands that are busy nailing boards or kneading dough in the kitchen of the monastery. But the one thing you have to do, though, is live by a rhythm of engagement and disengagement. A lot of people falsely claim the Benedict option is about heading for the hills to escape the apocalypse. That's not true at all. I say in the first chapter, there is no escape. We have to live with this, especially if we're lay people who live in the world. But what we have to do is construct the habitus, the way of life within our own lives in the world, so that we can escape somewhat from the world in order to retain our perspective on it and not to lose our sight of the truths we have. And indeed, one of the monks I quote in the book of the monastery in Norcia in central Italy, where St. Benedict was born, he said, we get people who come all the time in the summer. They want to hear us pray and sing, and we give spiritual counsel to them. But we can only do that because at certain hours of the day, we shut the door and they can't come in, because we need that time to be quiet and contemplative so we can build up the spiritual strength and the wisdom to share it, to help these people when they come to us when the gates are open. And that's good advice for an ordinary life, not only of Christians, but of everybody else. You can't stay completely engaged all the time without depleting yourselves spiritually and emotionally and mentally. I think maybe that's one thing that I've seen in my own life, and I know a lot of people have, the fact that I find it very hard to turn off what's in my head. I struggle with silence. But I have to learn how to embrace silence. In Orthodox Christianity, we have the Jesus prayer, which, if you pray it in the right way, it's a simple prayer: Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But if you pray it in the Orthodox way, you have to get very still, push out all extraneous thoughts, and focus entirely with a clear mind on the prayer. It's extremely hard to do. But I remember being assigned when I was so sick in 2012, 2013. I was very, very sick with chronic mononucleosis, which had come on me because of deep, deep stress. My Orthodox priest said, I want you to say 500 Jesus prayers a day, which would be about an hour of quiet meditation. It's like, are you serious? Really? It would be easier for me, sick as I was, to walk 5 miles a day than do that. But I did it on obedience. And over a while, this helped heal me because it forced me to achieve inner stillness, something I had to learn to do. It doesn't come natural, to achieve inner stillness for at least an hour a day. And that inner stillness helped make me calmer overall, such that my immune system was able to recover and fight off the disease. But I remember asking the priest afterwards, how did you know that's what I needed? That was the medicine I needed. He said, simple. I had to get you out of your head. You are, we live too much in our heads.
I think every summer I go to the countryside to where my wife's family is from, and very close by, maybe 10 minutes by car, is one of the oldest, most famous sites of a famous cloister in Sweden that was burnt down after the Renaissance, after the Reformation. It's in Vadstena. I usually take my time once per year at least to stroll through the ruins. It's very close to a camping site, so you have like bands from Holland, Germany, or whatnot. But nobody pays attention to the ruins. They're, obscenely beautiful. The ruins of what for me civilization is, and it's a very tragical site in a lot of senses, right? To what's been lost. It's sort of a memento of that. But a few miles up the road, there's a new monastery, and it's built by actually a couple of women who used to do social. They wanted to find, this was in the 70s and 80s, they wanted to find a new way to live, something to focus their spiritual energies on. And they bought a small plot of land, and now I think there are 40 or 50 nuns living there. And they have a huge orchard, and they sell berries and strawberries in the summer. I always make it a point to go to both of these places. And I actually read your book this summer, and I was contemplating this, and I found it so poetic that you could sort of have the ruins of what was, and the sort of new initiative of these people actually in the last 30 years doing this again. It's something literally out of this world, especially in this country, start something like that. And it sort of brings it home, the points you've been making to me.
Well, maybe we can end on this then. I read a quote, I think, by Balzac years ago. He said, hope is memory plus desire. So when I hear people say, well, you can't turn back the clock, you can't be nostalgic, That's true to a certain extent. That you're right. We can never, because even if you try to recover something in the past, you are always going to be aware that it is in the past, and that to some extent you are live action role playing. However, it really is true that you can recover some of this. I mean, these monks in Norcia in Italy, Napoleon shut down the monastery 200 years ago, but a group of American monks, maybe 20 years ago, moved there and opened it again. You know, that's crazy. This monastery has been shut down. Religious life is dead in the hometown of St. Benedict, monastic life, except it's not. It's living again. And these monks now have become known the world over. People make pilgrimages there all the time. They chant the Mass in Latin. They're traditionalists. And I think that's a wonderful thing. You know, in America now, you have a lot of young Catholics who are starting to go to the Latin Mass. Now, when I was a Catholic, that wasn't my thing, but I was glad it was there. And it makes baby boomer Catholics so angry because they thought, no, that's the past. That's the past. It's dead. We can't go back there. But they want it, these young people, because they can see something really beautiful there that the progressives in their own church threw out. And they want to recover it. So as long as we can remember the good things in the past and we desire to recapitulate them in whatever way we can, knowing that we can never fully inhabit it as it was the first time around, then why not? I mean, you know, there's nothing stopping us but our own imagination.